Bantam Doubleday Dell Audio Publishing presents Mirror Image by Danielle Steel. Chapter 1. The sound of the birds outside was muffled by the heavy brocade curtains of Henderson Manor. As Olivia Henderson pushed aside a lock of long, dark hair and continued her careful inventory of her father's china. It was a warm summer day, and as usual her sister had gone off somewhere. Her father, Edward Henderson, was expecting a visit from his lawyers. Nestled as they were in Croton-on-Hudson, nearly a 3-hour drive from New York, his attorneys came to see him fairly often. Edward Henderson ran all his investments from here, as well as overseeing the steel mills which still bore his name, but which he no longer ran himself. He had retired from business entirely 2 years before in 1911, maintaining all his holdings, but trusting entirely in his attorneys and the men who ran the mills for him. With no sons, he no longer had the interest in business that he once did. His daughters would never run his steel mills. He was only 65, but his health had begun to fail over the past few years, and he preferred viewing the world from his peaceful perch in Croton-on-Hudson. Here he could observe the world quietly, and it was a healthy, wholesome life for his 2 daughters. It was not exciting, admittedly, but they were never bored, and they had friends among all the grand families up and down the Hudson. The Van Cortlandt Manor was nearby, as were the Shepherds on the old Lyndhurst estate. Helen Shepard's father had been Jay Gould, and he had died 20 years before, and left the extraordinary property to his daughter. She and her husband, Finley Shepard, ran it beautifully, and gave frequent parties for the young people nearby. The Rockefellers had finished building Kykuit in Tarrytown that year, with its splendid gardens and magnificent grounds, and a house which rivaled Edward Henderson's just north of them at Croton-on-Hudson. Henderson Manor was a handsome home, and one which people came from miles to see, peering through the gates into the lovely gardens. They could barely see the house from where they stood, shielded as it was by tall trees and little turns in the road which led to the formal driveway. The house itself sat high on a cliff looking over the Hudson River, and Edward liked to sit in his study for hours, watching the world drift by, remembering times past, old friends, and the days when his life had moved a great deal more quickly, taking over his father's mills in the 1870s, being instrumental in the many industrial changes at the end of the last century. His life had been so busy then. When he was younger, his life had been so different. Edward Henderson had married when he was young and lost a wife and a young son to diphtheria. After that he had been alone for many years until Elizabeth came along. She had been everything any man could ever dream of, a bright shining streak of light, a comet in a summer sky, so ephemeral, so dazzling, so beautiful, and so much too quickly gone. They were married within the year they met. She was 19 and he was in his early 40s. By 21 she was gone. Much to Edward's horror, she had died in childbed. After her death he had worked even harder than usual, driving himself until he was numb. He had left his daughters to the care of his housekeeper and their nurses, but finally he realized that he had a responsibility to them. It was then that he began building Henderson Manor. He wanted them to have healthy, wholesome lives out of the city. New York was no place for children in 1903. They had been 10 when he'd actually moved them, and now they were 20. He kept the house in the city and worked there, but he came up to see them as often as he could, at first only on weekends, and then, as he fell in love with it, he began spending more time on the Hudson rather than in New York or Pittsburgh or Europe. His heart was there in Croton with his daughters as he watched them grow, and little by little his own life began moving more slowly. He loved being with them, and now he never left them any more. For the past 2 years he had gone absolutely nowhere. His health had begun to fail 3 or 4 years before. His heart was a problem, but only when he worked too hard, or let things upset him, or got terribly angry, which he seldom did now. He was happy in Croton, with his daughters. It had been 20 years since their mother had died in the spring of 1893. On a warm, balmy day, that had appeared to him to be God's ultimate betrayal. He had been waiting outside, filled with such pride and so much excitement. He had never dreamed it could happen to him again. His first wife and infant son had died in an epidemic of diphtheria more than a dozen years before. But this time, losing Elizabeth had almost killed him. At 45, it was a near mortal blow to him, and he almost couldn't bear going on without her. She had died in their home in New York, and at first he felt her presence there. But after a while he came to hate the emptiness of it, and he had hated being there. He had traveled off and on for months after that, but avoiding the house meant avoiding the 2 little girls Elizabeth had left him, and he couldn't bring himself to sell the house his father had built and that he had grown up in. A traditionalist to the core, he felt an obligation to maintain it for his children. He had closed it eventually, and it had been 2 years since he'd been there. Now that he lived in Croton full-time, he never missed it. Neither the house, nor New York, nor the social life he'd left there. And as the summer sounds droned on, Olivia continued her painstaking inventory of the china. She had long sheets of paper on which she wrote in her meticulous hand, making note of what they needed to replace and what had to be ordered. Sometimes she sent one of the servants to the house in town to bring something up to them, but for the most part the city house was closed, and they never went there. She knew her father didn't like it. Her father's health was frail, and like him, she was happy here in their quiet life in Croton-on-Hudson. She had actually spent very little time in New York since she was a child, except for the brief time 2 years before, when her father had taken them to New York to present them to society and all his friends. She had found it interesting, but truly exhausting. She was overwhelmed by the parties, the theater, the constant social demands made on them. She had felt as though she were on stage the entire time, and she hated the attention. It was Victoria who had thrived on it, and who had been in a state of total gloom when they returned to Croton at Christmas. Olivia had been relieved to return to her books, their home, her horses, her peaceful walks high on the cliff, which led her sometimes to neighboring farms. She loved riding here and listening to the sounds of spring, watching winter melt slowly away from them, seeing the splendor of the turning leaves in October. She loved taking care of her father's house for him, and had since she was a very young girl, with the help of Alberta Peabody, the woman who had raised them. She was Bertie to them, and the closest to a mother the Henderson girls had ever known. Her eyes were poor, but her mind was sharp, and she could have told the 2 young women apart in the dark, with her eyes closed. She came to check on Olivia now, and asked her how far she had gotten. She didn't have the patience or the eyes to do this kind of minute work any more, and she was always grateful when Olivia did it for her. Olivia carefully checked the embroidery, the crystal, the linens. She kept an eye on everything, and she loved doing it, unlike Victoria, who detested all things domestic. Victoria was, in every possible way, different from her sister. "Well, have they broken all our plates, or will we still be able to manage Christmas dinner?" Bertie smiled as she held up a glass of ice-cold lemonade and a plate of ginger snaps fresh out of the oven. Alberta Peabody had spent 20 years caring for the 2 girls she had come to think of as her children. They had become hers at birth, and she had never left them for a day, not since their mother had died. And she had first looked into Olivia's eyes and realized instantly how much she loved her. She was a short, round woman, with white hair and a small bun at the back of her head. She had an ample bosom where Olivia had rested her head through most of her childhood. She had comforted them whenever they needed it, and whenever their father wasn't there, which had been often when they were young. For years he had grieved silently for their mother and kept his distance. But he had warmed toward them in recent years, and softened considerably since his health had begun to fail, and he had retired from business. He had a weak heart which he attributed to the shock and grief of losing 2 young wives, and the aggravations of modern business. He was far happier now that he was running things from here, and everything could be filtered for him through his attorneys. "We need soup plates, Bertie," Olivia reported solemnly, brushing the long dark hair back again, totally unaware of her startling beauty. She had creamy white skin. huge dark blue eyes, and thick shining black hair.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?